It should be well.
No, I can't tell you who it was.
I guess not. Okay. Yeah, everything should go smoothly. Okay. All right. So we're on 103a, Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, and we are going to talk about warts. Warts on animals. Don't worry, not on people. Okay, so here we go. So severing a wart, as we'll see, there is forbidden on Shabbos. So the same would be true in general. Taking off a pimple on Shabbos, we don't pop pimples on Shabbos. But there will be distinctions between things being rabbinic, being biblical. So let's jump in. So choschen yabelas b'mikdash. The Mishnah says a person's allowed to sever a wart from an animal with your hand in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. Okay, so there is you are not to bring an animal with a wart on is a form of a mum, but it's a mum that you're able. It's a blemish. It's a blemish you're able to get rid of, and therefore you would normally get. If it was during the week, you would take a utensil and you'd scrape off the wart, and that's what you do. You'd have dermatologists sitting around in the Beis HaMikdash helping you remove the warts before the carbon is brought. But let's say it's a carbon that's supposed to be brought on Shabbos, and there are carbonos tzibor, like the karban atamid, the daily offerings that are brought, and let's say the animal that they're about to bring, they notice there's a wart, so the Mishnah says they're allowed to sever that wart with their hand. Avaloba Medina, but this cannot be done in the provinces, meaning outside the Beis HaMikdash. Bin bechli kan v'kan asur, but to do so with an instrument is forbidden both in the Beis HaMikdash as well as outside the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, now the Gemara is going to challenge this halacha from a brisa. If you look in Kuf Gimel, further right after the Mishnah 103a2, Uraminhu, the Gemara asks from a brisa here, and the brisa over here is a brisa in from another Mishnah, excuse me. This Mishnah is in Maseches Psachim, which we'll be starting, God willing, on Tuesday. Very exciting. So the Mishnah over there says like this, Herkevo, that if a person is going to bring a Karban Pesach, so let's say Pesach falls out on Matzei Shabbos. So the Karban Pesach has to still be slaughtered and burnt, and they start the process of burning it already on Friday. On Shabbos, on Erev Pesach. So that would normally be done. In other words, right? So if Pesach falls out on Matzei Shabbos, then they would still bring the Karban Pesach on Erev Pesach, which is Shabbos, and that is 100% allowed. Everyone agrees that that's allowed. However, Herkevo, carrying the animal from outside the Beis HaMikdash into the Beis HaMikdash, or bringing it from outside the Tchum, the chatichas yabalto, and cutting off the wart, ein dochin, it does not override Shabbos. Right? Rabbi Eliezer Amar Dochin, Rabbi Eliezer, though, disagrees and says that it does override Shabbos. So you see from this Mishnah that, at least according to the Tanna Kama, that you are not allowed to remove a wart on Shabbos, right? And yet our Mishnah said you are allowed to do so, right? You're with me on the contradiction? Very straightforward contradiction. Our Mishnah says you are allowed to remove the warts by hand, and this Mishnah says you can't do so. Now, it's worth noting, before you ask the question, why don't we just say that our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer in this Mishnah is saying you are allowed to remove the warts. The reason we don't do so is because Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that you're even allowed to do so in a biblical fashion. Rabbi Eliezer, when he says you are allowed to remove the wart, presumably he's saying even with a utensil. And if he says to do so with a utensil, our Mishnah says it cannot be done with a utensil, and therefore our Mishnah is not Rabbi Eliezer. It should be lined up with the Tanna Kama, and yet the Tanna Kama in Psachim says it cannot be done, and the Mishnah in Eruvin says it can be done. So we're going to see a couple of different ways of reconciling the Mishnah and the Brisa. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. So Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. So first we have Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi Chanina, who are going to give two different solutions. Chad Amar Hava Habalacha. One says that both the Mishnah in Eruvin and the Mishnah in Psachim are both referring to moist warts. Okay, meaning it's still like alive. It still is really connected to the body. It's moist. V'lo kashav, there's no contradiction. Why? Kan biyad. The Mishnah in Maseches Eruvin is referring to removing it by hand, saying you're allowed to remove it by hand. And kan b'kli, and the Mishnah in Psachim, which said it cannot be done, is referring to you cannot do it with the utensil, because doing it with the utensil is biblically prohibited, and that's why the Mishnah Psachim says you cannot do it, whereas the Mishnah in Eruvin that said you can do it is saying you're allowed to do so by hand, which is rabbinic, right? And therefore there's no contradiction. And the other one of these Amoraim say that no, both Mishnayos are referring to a situation where you're removing it by hand. There's no difficulty. Habalacha, the Mishnah Psachim refers to a moist wart. Habiyavesha, and the Mishnah in Eruvin refers to a dry wart. What's the difference between a dry wart and a moist wart? A dry wart, as we're going to see, is basically not really, it's nothing. It's like dirt at that point. So in other words, once it's dry, it's not really there. It's kind of like you just like scratch it off and it's removed and your skin's right there. It's not really still attached to you in a full sense, and therefore it's going to be much, it's permitted to remove the dry wart. Okay, now the Gemara is going to wonder why each of these opinions did not address this contradiction like the other one did. right? In other words, opinion A says, the following. Opinion B says the following. The question is, why doesn't A say like B? Why doesn't B say like A? So, according to the one who said that an Eruvin refers to removing it by hand, and Psachim refers to removing it by an instrument, my time why did that opinion not answer that the Mishnah Psachim refers to a moist wart, and that's why it said it's forbidden, and the one in Eruvin refers to a dry wart, and that's why it said it is allowed? Amar Lach, he would say to you, because a dry one, according to this opinion, he says a dry one can even be removed by a utensil. My time, why? Because it's basically disintegrating. In other words, if you want to, the reason that he does not say that our Mishnah is referring to a dry one, the reason this opinion does not say our Mishnah is referring to a dry one, because it says if it was actually referring to a dry one, then it would be actually permitted to remove it even with a utensil, because there's nothing there. In other words, once it's dry, if you have a dry wart, so imagine like a dry pimple, a completely dried out pimple, then you're not actually removing anything. Let's actually take a step back. Why are you not allowed to remove a wart on Shabbos? What's the prohibition? So it's not actually coming from bleeding, but that is a possible concern when it comes to pimples. There's another concern, something called gozes. Gozes is that you're not allowed to shear the hair of an animal. So basically any growth on an animal, okay, and it'll be true for a person as well, cannot be removed. You can't pluck hair, right? Similar, right, because doing so is one of the 39 prohibitions of shearing, okay? And similarly, you're not allowed to take a growth from a body, because it's shearing, it's taking something from a live body. Now, when it's completely dried out, you're no longer really removing it. It's disintegrating. Sorry? It's like a scab, right? And therefore he says, according to this opinion, he says, why would our Mishnah, if you want to tell me the difference is, one's dry, meaning the Mishnah in Eruvin is when it's dry, the Mishnah Psachim is when it's moist, then why would our Mishnah in Eruvin tell us it has to be removed by hand? It should be able to be removed even with a utensil. Okay, now we turn to the other person. According to the one who said that the Mishnah Psachim refers to a moist one, and the one in Eruvin refers to a dry one, my time alo amar habiyad habachli. Why does this person not answer that the Mishnah Eruvin is referring to by hand, the Mishnah Psachim is referring to by an instrument? Amar Lach, he says, Bechli, if our Mishnah, the Mishnah Psachim is referring to removing it with an instrument, then Atnan and Bechli, kan v'kan aser. Then our Mishnah already told us that removing it with a utensil is forbidden. Why would you have to repeat it in Masechet Psachim? In other words, the reason this one, the reason the one who said dry versus moist doesn't say hand versus kli, utensil, is because the Mishnah Psachim already tells us, because the Mishnah in Eruvin already tells us explicitly that you are not allowed to remove it with an instrument. So why would it have to be repeated in Psachim? So the Gemara says, "V'idach," the other one would reply, the reason why it's repeated in Psachim is not to teach us the main halacha, to tell you that it cannot be done with a utensil. The reason it's repeated is because in Psachim we want to also introduce us to the view of Rabbi Eliezer, who says even with utensil it's permitted. And that's why we repeat it over there. Okay? V'idach, and the other opinion who says that the Mishnah refers to by hand and not with an instrument, what he brings a support to his view, because the Mishnah, again, he's saying the Mishnah Psachim is referring to a case where it's being removed by hand, whereas our Mishnah over here is referring to when it's being removed by a utensil. So he's going to support, the fact that he's saying the Mishnah Psachim is referring to a case where it's being removed by hand. Why? Because what are the other cases in the Mishnah Psachim? It refers to what the other cases are: carrying the animal and going beyond the tchum. Is carrying an animal in a public domain rabbinically prohibited or biblically prohibited? Dun, dun, dun. Take a guess, 50-50 chance. Okay? Carrying an animal, so here's the halacha. So if you carry something which is alive, according to, we'll see, Rav Nassan, but most opinions, carrying something that is alive, meaning a person or an animal, is only rabbinically prohibited. Why? Because we talked about this before, if you carry a child when the child is asleep versus carrying a child when the child is awake, what's lighter, asleep or awake? Asleep. So, no, awake. Asleep. When the kid's asleep, if a child's asleep, you carry I just carried my 9-year-old the other day from they fell asleep in the wrong bed. Okay, you carry them, they're dead weight, right? They're really heavy. When they're awake, they're carrying themselves. They're actually much lighter. Try it. Put a kid to sleep and go carry them. Find out. But the bottom line is, it's very clear that you carry a sleeping person, or animal, it's going to be much heavier. They're just, and when they're awake, they are carrying themselves. Chai noses atzmo. Because they're carrying themselves, there is the opinion of Rav Nassan, which we're going to introduce now, it says that is when you carry such a being, whether it's an animal or a person, while they're awake, then it is only rabbinically prohibited because you're not really fully carrying it. They're also carrying themselves. So that Mishnah Psachim, again, this view is trying to say that the Mishnah Psachim is referring to a case where it's being done by hand. Now, and supporting their view by saying, look, the other cases listed in that Mishnah are also rabbinic cases. One is, why? Because Dumya, let's just read inside. Dumya Derakeva va'asa mechutz l'tchum kitani d'Rabbanan. The other cases of that Mishnah are both d'Rabbanan. Why? Because one of them is carrying the animal through the Rosh Hashanah, and presumably the animal is awake, and therefore that's only rabbinic. And going beyond the tchum is rabbinic or biblical. According to most, it is rabbinic. Tchum is rabbinic. And therefore, this view is trying to support their view by saying, listen, the Mishnah in Psachim is all rabbinic cases. And therefore, don't tell me we're talking about, like you, the other view is saying we're talking about a case where it's being done, that the Mishnah Psachim is referring to a case where it's being done with a utensil. No, I'll prove to you that it's talking about a rabbinic case where it's being done by hand, because the other cases in the Mishnah are also rabbinic cases. V'idach, the other one would push back and say, I know this is a little hard, we're doing a little ping pong over here. The other one would push back and say, Herkevo delok Rabbi Nassan, 103a3, the case of carrying the animal is not like Rav Nassan, to Amar Achai no says Atzmo. Rav Nassan is the one who says that a living creature supports its own weight, but there are others who disagree. And maybe the Mishnah in Psachim is coming from a different Tana who says that carrying an animal maybe is a biblical prohibition because they reject this view that a live being carries themselves. And if you recall, we had the view of Rabbi Akiva who said that tchum is deraisa, and therefore maybe that Mishnah in Psachim is actually talking about cases which are biblical and not rabbinic. Okay, so bottom line is we now had two possible answers to this question. There's the contradiction between Psachim and Eruvin. One answer is to say that the Mishnah in Eruvin is referring to removing the wart by hands, which is an unusual method and therefore is rabbinic, and that's why it's permitted in the Beis Hamikdash. Whereas the Mishnah Psachim, which said it cannot be done, is referring to removing it by the utensil, which is biblical. Alternatively, the way to answer it is to say that the Mishnah in Psachim is referring to a moist wart, which is d'oraisa, and that's why it's not allowed, whereas the Mishnah in Eruvin is referring to a dry one, and that's why it is allowed. Okay, but now the Gemara is going to reject this. Master Rav Yosef. Yosef asked the following question. Amar Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar, meaning the Mishnah in Psachim continues and quotes Rabbi Eliezer saying as follows, Kal v'chomer. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah Psachim told us, you are allowed to override Shabbos, and carry the animal. You're allowed to go ahead and go michutz l'tchum. You're allowed to go outside the tchum, and you're allowed to remove the wart. And Rabbi Eliezer then goes ahead and proves and supports his view. What does he say? He says, Kal v'chomer umashchita shemishum malacha dochas haShabbos, in as much as slaughtering the Pesach offering, Pesach sacrifice, which is biblically prohibited, nonetheless override Shabbos. Elu shemishum shvus eno din sheyitchos haShabbos. These things which are rabbinically prohibited, they certainly should override Shabbos. So the fact that Eliezer, in his arguments with the Rabbanan, in that Mishnah in Psachim, says that these cases, the things that we're talking about, are rabbinic. So clearly, he's saying that they are rabbinic things, right? So clearly, again, he's saying explicitly, they're referring to cases which they are rabbinic, and therefore it cannot be referring to a case of a moist wort. And therefore, Rav Yosef wants to reject the two answers above, and he's going to give his own answer. Elam Rav Yosef says the following. He says, Hava Habiyad, a new way of reconciling the Mishnah and in Psachim and the Mishnah in Eruvin, is to say that in both cases being done by hands. Okay, so what's the difference? He says, he introduces a new idea. Ushvus mikdash b'mikdash hitiru, shvus de mikdash b'medina lo hitiru. He points out that although until now we've had a general understanding that anything that's being done for the Beis Hamikdash could be done if it's being done rabbinically. Okay, right? That was the general rule that we saw. We said anything for the Beis Hamikdash, as long as it's rabbinic, it could be done. But he points out that there's really a distinction between the geography. He says, when it's being done for the Beis Hamikdash and it's on the Temple Mount area, then it could be done if it's rabbinically prohibited. If it's being done for the Beis Hamikdash, but it's not on the Temple Mount area, then it cannot be done. So what's an example of that? Okay, so the karban that is being brought for the congregation. So for example, the karban tamid, which was brought on Shabbos, they would inspect it and slaughter it and do everything on the Temple Mount. Okay? And therefore, the Mishnah in Eruvin, which says you're allowed to go ahead and remove the warts, so if it's going to be removed rabbinically, meaning by hand, which is an abnormal way of doing it, so it can be done by hand. If it's being done, let's say the Mishnah Eruvin is referring to, let's say, the karban tamid, which is being brought, or the musaf that is being brought on Shabbos, and they would inspect it on the Temple Mount, therefore you're allowed to remove the wart. The karban Pesach, they would inspect back at home. Before they bring it to the Temple Mount, you have to inspect it at home. So although it's being used for a sanctified purpose, it's being used for the Beis Hamikdash, and we would have thought, therefore, it's only rabbinic, I should be able to do it. No, since it's not on the Temple Mount, it's not being done in that space, therefore it cannot be done, and that's what the Mishnah Pesachim is telling us, even though it's being done by hand, i.e. rabbinic, but since it's not on the Temple Mount, that's why it's not going to be allowed. Okay, that's the new distinction that he's going to make. Ask the Gemara asked, and now we're going to come back to our Eruvin discussion. I don't know if you remember, we went on a massive tangent. We've really moved away from Eruvin, but we're going to go back to a Mishnah we had a short while ago. Yasv Abaye, v'kamar lahashmaita. Abaye, who was the student of Rav Yosef, taught this teaching to his students. Eisvei Rav Safra l'Abaye, and Rav Safra asked Abaye from the following Mishnah, the Mishnah we learned earlier. Hayakor b'sefer ali skupa, a person's reading a book on Shabbos on a threshold. V'niskalgel hasefer miyado, and the book that he's reading, the Sefer, the holy book that he's reading, rolls from his hands and lands into the Rishus Rabbim, Golo Etzlo, you're allowed to roll it back to yourself. Okay, so that's the case in the Mishnah. Again, the Mishnah is talking about a case where a person is reading a Sefer, person's reading a holy book, and the book rolls out of their hands, and they're holding on to it, right? They are, now the Gemara is going to assume, as the Gemara says, now it's a case of a rabbinic prohibition that is similar to a temple procedure, okay? And we don't make a decree that maybe the scroll is going to fall out into the public domain and the person is going to roll it back into the private domain. So what's going on over here? Where's the Beis Hamikdash over here? We're talking about reading a book. So like this, the Gemara is talking about, the Mishnah at this point, the Gemara is assuming that the Mishnah is talking about a case where a person is standing in the private domain and they're reading a scroll. Right, and that a scroll rolls. Okay, so I'm reading a holy book. I'm reading Tanakh. I'm reading the Parsha. Right, I'm reading out of a Torah scroll, and it rolls out of my hands, and I'm holding on to it. It falls into public domain. Now, at that point, if I were to let go of it completely, it would go from the private domain to the public domain. If I were then go pick it up from the public domain and bring it down back into the private domain, I'd be in violation of a biblical prohibition. Right, but the fact that I'm holding on to it. Right? But then I'm holding on to it, and therefore, as long as I'm holding on to the item, it's still only rabbinically prohibited. There could be a concern that I'm going to drop it and then bring it back, but we don't make such a decree. Now, again, where's the Beis Hamikdash discussion? The answer to that is that since we're talking about a holy book, we're talking about a book which is being used for learning purposes, the Gemara assumes that whatever principles apply for the Beis Hamikdash, which is also a holy service, is going to be equivalent to learning a Sefer, which is also a holy service. It's a bit of a jump. It's a bit of a leap. But one way, right? But you see the parallel, right? In other words, the Gemara is saying, look, at the end of the day, you want to tell me, you, Rav Yosef, want to distinguish between a holy service on the Temple Mount versus a holy service off the Temple Mount, and you want to tell me the rabbinic laws are only waived when they're on the Temple Mount, but when they're not on the Temple Mount, that they're not waived. But wait a second, we have this case of reading this book that falls from your hands, and we say, even though there's room for rabbinic prohibition, right? We say you're allowed to roll it back. Why are you allowed to roll it back? Presumably, the Gemara assumes the reason you're allowed to roll it back is because it's for a holy purpose. And clearly you see that even a holy service, a holy purpose, which is off the Temple Mount, we don't make rabbinic decrees, right? Which seems to, yeah.
It's saying that if you remain in the Carmelie, you can roll your part of, or half of the half that you still retain until the rest of it comes back to you, or they say you can keep it in your hands, step out into the public domain, pick up.
So you're saying you're allowed to roll it back. They're saying you're allowed to roll it back, even though, right, and we're saying we're not concerned that it's going to fall out and you're going to actually go and pick it up.
Because physically you always remain in the private.
Exactly, and physically the book itself always remained physically you remained there, and the book was always still in the private domain. So the Gemara basically is trying to ask that Rav Yosef's distinction is not a good distinction. Ask the Gemara, V'lo kimna biskupa karmelis rishus ramba veres lefanea. So Gemara says, wait a second, there's no proof from there, because we already in our Gemara previously, we established that the threshold we're talking about over here is not a private domain, it's a karmelis. It's a Carmelist. A Carmelist, now, if you transfer something from a Carmelist to a public domain, is that rabbinically or biblically prohibited? It's only rabbinically prohibited. And therefore, at the very most, you would have been in violation of rabbinic prohibition. That's why, and since over here, the person's still holding on to it, there's not even room to make a rabbinic prohibition. There's no reason for that. There's absolutely no reason to make such a prohibition, and that's why the Gemara says there's no proof to Rav Yosef's principle. The Gemara is going to ask Rav Safra is going to ask another question to Rav Yosef's principle. Eisvei, and here's a much more direct question. And here we're talking about a situation where the first day of Pesach is Shabbos. Okay, so the Gemara says, so again, meaning over here, Erev Pesach is Erev Shabbos, and Shabbos is Pesach. Pesach is Shabbos. And the Mishnah says in Maseches Pesachim, a person's allowed to lower the Pesach, the carbon Pesach, into the oven right before Shabbos, okay, right before Shabbos. Now, are you allowed to go ahead and place food on a fire right before Shabbos? The answer is absolutely not. You have to wait until it's cooked a certain amount, right? And nonetheless, we say you're allowed to put the Karban Pesach into the oven before Shabbos. Okay, v'hacha d'shvustim mikdash, and we're talking about something which is rabbinically prohibited by Medina. And where would they burn the Karban Pesach? They wouldn't put them in the fire on the Temple Mounts. Where would they do it? They would do it elsewhere. They would do it back at home, right? In other words, what would happen is they'd slaughter the animal, they'd sprinkle the blood on the base of Mikdash, and then they take the animal back and they'd put it on a fire in their backyard, right? So over here, once again, you find a case where they are bringing offerings, which are where they're doing base of Mikdash related things, and they're doing something which would otherwise be rabbinically prohibited, and they're doing it outside of the base of Mikdash. Rav Yosef wanted to distinguish between doing rabbinic laws which are prohibited on the Temple Mount versus not the Temple Mount, and here you see explicitly it's a base on Mikdash, meaning it's a holy avoda, meaning it's something which is based on Mikdash related, but it's being done off of the Temple Mount, and nonetheless it is permitted. Right? You with me? We don't make the general prohibition of the fact that a person might stoke the coals. With me on the question? Again, one more time. Rav Yosef wanted to distinguish between a case where Rav Yosef said this general rule that we had until now, which said that anything for the base of Mikdash, as long as it's rabbinic, is waived. He says that is only true if it's being done on the Makom HaMikdash, in the Temple Mount. But if it's being done outside, it cannot be done. And yet over here, we see very clearly that you're allowed to put your Karban Pesach into an oven right before Shabbos, which is normally rabbinically prohibited, right? And it's allowed to be done, even though it's not being done on the Temple Mount. And therefore, Rav Yosef's principle is incorrect, seemingly. Ishtik, Abai didn't have a good answer. And then Abai goes back to his Rebbe, he goes back to Rav Yosef, he goes back to his teacher Rav Yosef, Amarle Hachi, Amarle Rav Safra, and he tells him the story, the whole dialogue. He says, Rebbe, Rav Yosef, I taught your teaching to Rav Safra, he asked me the following question, I didn't have an answer. Amarle says, my time alot shanile, b'nei chaburas reason hain. He said, why didn't you answer that it's different? When it comes to Karban Pesach, we have a rule, which we'll see in Maseches Pesachim, and that is that when people are joining together to prepare for the Karban Pesach, they have a certain intensity. They have a certain, when you're in the midst of, when maybe you're like sitting at home, maybe you're feeling a little lazy. But when you are preparing the Karban Pesach and you're doing so in a group, then the group is going to encourage one another and prevent them from doing anything wrong. And therefore, although it's true at home, if you forgot to make your chicken or your meat or whatever it is, you can't put it in the oven right before Shabbos. Why? Because there's a concern I might adjust the heat. But if you're preparing the Karban Pesach and you're there with a group of people, right? Because Karban Pesach cannot be eaten alone. You have to do so with a group of people because you have to finish that entire animal together. So there's a whole group of people there, and you're getting ready for Pesach. There, everyone's going to remind one another, and therefore there's no problem. And therefore he says this is an exception; it's not the rule. Okay, if Abaye, why didn't Abaye give the same answer? He says Kohanim's reason Hein Amrinan, because he says this rule that people are careful, we only say about the Kohanim, we only say about priests. Bnei Chabura's reason Hein Lo Amrinan. We don't say such a rule about the members of a Pesach group. We don't make such a distinction. Okay, fine. The Gemara. So that's Rav Yosef's answer. Now we're going to see one more answer, which we're going to unpack more in detail tomorrow. But let's see the answer. Rava Amar Eliezer Rava says that really the way to address the contradiction is to say that our Mishnah is actually Rabbi Eliezer. D'Amar Machshir Mitzvah Dochanas Shabbos. Okay, and who holds that generally preparations for a mitzvah override Shabbos. Now, why did we not say our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer until now? Because Rabbi Eliezer would say that you could even go ahead and be Docha Shabbos with a utensil. Rabbi Eliezer is the one who holds that as long as it's being done for preparations, it could be, then you're allowed, it overrides Shabbos. And normally that would be true even with a utensil. So why in our Mishnah does Rabbi Eliezer say it should only be done with with your hand and not with the utensil? Because Umod Eliezer dekamad efshel shanuye meshaninan. Because Rabbi Eliezer agrees that whenever it's possible to do it in a rabbinic fashion, you should. Rabbi Eliezer agrees that in theory, if your push comes to shove, then you could do it. Then you're allowed to do it with a biblical prohibition. But if the only way to do so is, if there is a way of getting around doing a biblical prohibition, and you could do it in a rabbinic fashion, then Rabbi Eliezer would say you're allowed to do so, and that's why in our Mishnah, if really we're saying now the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, why does it say you could do it by hand? According to Rabbi Eliezer, you should even be able to do it by the utensil. The answer is, Rabbi Eliezer says, when you're stuck, not when you're stuck, when you're able to do so by hand, when you're able to avoid the biblical prohibition, then you should do so, and that's the way to understand our Mishnah. We will pick up on this view, God willing, tomorrow. Have a great day.